the years we've talked about, just given some of the work that I do with younger generations, with children and with families in particular, I think my observation of like the influence of history in terms of how people of color, Black folks, have responded to racism. I think most notably, as you started, I think in the last question, to highlight that it becomes a question for the parents or caretakers, right, in terms of what information, what exposures are being passed on. What I found most noteworthy some decades ago in working with youth was that they were reporting to me that there weren't explicit conversations, to your point, not just about strategy, but about race at all. And so I think that was both intriguing and also so noteworthy for me that we stopped and actually had a meeting with the parents of the young folks that I was working with in an effort to better understand, right? I think psychologists and other social sciences talk about racial socialization and how important it is. And so we wanted to better understand what happened, what we heard, I think very explicitly from parents was that they think about the history of race relations in the context of the United States in particular. There was so much experience of kind of intergenerational harm. The parents literally said to us, we had hoped, like we were so leaning towards with the civil rights movement, right? The hope that, race relations and certainly racism wouldn't be a significant factor, right, given legislation, that we didn't want to navigate our own pain and experience, and so therefore are not engaging in those conversations, sort of remain silent with the hopes that because the laws, right, in their eyes had changed, they wouldn't have to go through that kind of explicit socialization and conversations that they had with their parents or grandparents, right, or other generations. And so it was both eye-opening and also a reminder for them that in fact wasn't the case, right? That racism continues to show up and manifest in different ways. And that even if we need to, right, sort of hold on to hope as a means of resistance to oppression, we too have to continue the work of being explicit and educating and having conversations with younger generations to remind them of that history that it's just right. I keep saying it's just there. Because the lies, if I'm being honest, that youth are told in school systems it makes them think, even the youth that I worked with, that the sort of racism, right, segregation, all of those things are like they're so far removed from that. And then when you sit them down and say, let's look at the years, let's look at the timeline, then I think there's a very sobering reality for many of the youth that I worked with, and also an anger, right, that they were not exposed to this history, that no one help them understand the very real experiences that they were navigating in their lives, and just didn't have a framework, a context, or any language to describe.
And I may have my generations not quite right, but I think the parents of the young people now also were the victims of parents who thought that the civil rights movement was going to make it unnecessary for them to teach about race and racism.
Yes.
So we have a generation in which the children don't know, but their parents don't know either.
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking when you said it's up to the caretakers, because yes, as time has moved on for me, I'm thinking, that was at least a couple of decades ago when I had that conversation. And so more time has passed, more rhetoric, right, around race relations. At the time I was working with those youth, we were in what folks were calling the post-racial era, because Obama was just being elected or just been elected. I think the campaign was happening. And then he was elected, and we had all the rhetoric around, of course, we're in a sort of post-racial America, and that was what they were hearing. So that we, in our groups working with them, talked about the messaging that they received and the distancing that they were often told was the case as they thought about, race relations in particular. In other words, that these are things of the past, they happened so long ago, and now everything is better. Right. So we've dealt with racism. And so introducing a new reality to them, I think rightfully so, brought about what you refer to as immersion, right, in racial identity theory, but just a sense of anger and upset, right, that they hadn't been told the truth in an effort to understand their experiences, that their experiences weren't even validated, and they weren't told the truth just about the history and the existence of racism explicitly by any of the adults or many of the adults around them. What's interesting and noteworthy for me, to your point, though, Dr. Helms, is that the youth that what I will say or describe as a psychologist were faring better in their educational environments. And that's not about grades, but were able to kind of resist or buffer some of their experiences were those that actually reported that their parents or caretakers, grandparents, aunties were having explicit conversations with them, not just about the history of race or racism, but also about the strategies that they needed to undertake in the school environment. And it was a stark difference. And they were unfortunately a minority in number amongst their peers of students of color.
Which I think is really important, because when I have talked to young people who encounter racism, they think for the first time, they don't, it nearly debilitates them. And so having the experience, and part of what I've discovered is that for those students who it just seems that they're totally disoriented with respect to their racism experience. When I talk to them, it's a matter of no, they couldn't talk to their parents about these experiences because their parents are still embedded in the notion that racism doesn't exist anymore. And so what do you do when you're feeling this thing for which you have no label for, but your parents tell you that it's not a real thing?
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever we do, we have to begin to re-educate Black parents, Black caretakers, so that they know that things may be better than they were in the 1800s, but in effect, there's still racism in the society. And if we are not ever vigilant, it will get worse rather than getting better.
Which I think we're seeing, right? The sort of legal permission, if you will, right, for things to get worse versus better. So whatever progress, right, that folks may articulate that has been made is being undone, I think, in many ways. And that was the gravity, I think, for me. On the day that I sent you the text message, it was shortly after I received a message from one of my good friends whose father called her and was very upset about the ruling because, as he noted, you know, his first job and really only official job that we knew him to have our entire lives, and he certainly retired from this organization. He said, yeah, I got this job because of affirmative action, period, right? I was able to support my family. I retired from there. And so what, right, is happening? And this is the same dad that, you know, I grew up with that would tell us stories of, you know, walking along the streets and having to walk to school while the white youth in his town were bused to school. And as he walked by and they drove by, they would throw things out at the window at him. So it just, I remember when he told us those stories growing up, and then to hear him, you know, and to see him so visibly upset because of his understanding, right, of what the legislation and sort of civil rights movement meant, and to see in 2023 this happening, for me, sort of sat in the pit of my stomach, and was a reminder again of just how close the history is and how much can be undone. Because I hold on to hope, as you've encouraged me to do, and certainly my family has encouraged me to do. But this was very upsetting. I think both the affirmative action ruling and then the ruling was it the next day or a couple of days later. And so I don't know. I have a son, you know that, and I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen. I've watched him grow up and sort of be in the public school system for the first time as an elementary school student, and I'm very concerned, right, about future generations, him included. Whereas I think for my parents and my generation, they were much more, at least, encouraged, right, about the possibilities that they saw for future generations. And now we're like, we don't know how much the pendulum will continue to swing and what that will mean in terms of the lived experiences of individuals. But I do think we have some examples, right? In talking to a colleague that talked about the legislation in California that in essence undid, you know, affirmative action, and years later kind of seeing how the state schools at California and from a socio-demographic perspective have shifted, where the idea was that they would, you know, do something different, the proposition, but in reality, students of color and other students that hold other marginalized identities are being pushed to certain state schools, and others, you know, are being reserved for white students. So if we are to attend to and pay attention to, right, sort of different trends, then I think that's, for me, is where I hold the most concern, given the recent rulings.
Yes, so um, hope is important.
Yes.
Um, and recognizing that in one way or another, we have bounced back. We've managed to subvert the system. And so I think once we get over our dismay that uh, these people that no one actually elected could have so much power over our lives, once we get over that dismay, then we have to begin to figure out how are we going to bounce back? How are we going to make their decision not matter?
Right.
We've done it before, and so we can probably do it again.
Yes.
We need the young people to begin to get on board.
Indeed. As I recall, right, younger generations have been instrumental, I think, historically in many of our social movements, really. Sort of, when I attended Fisk University and learning about that history, and then at some point it hits you, right, that you were the age of the folks that were, involved in a lot of the efforts and initiatives around the civil rights movement. But certainly we need younger folks, I agree with you, to understand what is happening on multiple fronts in an attempt to erase history or to minimize or dismiss history, sort of keep them at a place where they aren't able to both understand and therefore strategize, in other words, resist, right, the efforts to oppress them. That's, I think, for me, the biggest piece. So whether that's at home, sort of thinking about caretakers, but also just the alternatives to their educational experiences seem like they'd be critically important to raise that awareness so that they are on board and that they do understand that these things are connected across in many ways, and that they certainly need to be strategic to survive these systems in an effort to dismantle them.
And they also need to be aware of the subtle racism. Mm-hmm. So when I hear the phrase, young people of today don't believe in racism, well, that's not true. I've been on a university campus, and I know that young white people on university campuses believe in racism and engage in racism. And so if you teach Black and Latinx and for that matter, Asian students to accept that meme, that doctrine, then they don't know what it is that they need to fight against. And so we really need to protect them from being ignorant, I guess. Mm-hmm. Trust but verify, as they used to say about politics. So just don't believe that people have your best interest at heart. Let them show you that they do.
I'm wondering well, as a psychologist, a lot of your work, right, that you've been known for certainly has been recognized as being really essential and instrumental and innovative in the field of psychology. So I think for the psychologists or even mental health counselors or behavioral health providers, whatever language or labels we want to use, what's our role? What do you feel like our role should be? Again, so much of your work absolutely has implications for the field of psychology, but really is beyond the field of psychology in terms of its application and its relevance. So what do you say to our mental health folks, or even just psychologists really across the subdisciplines or fields of psychology? What should we be doing, thinking about, contributing to?
I don't know that I actually know the answer to that question. I often ask myself that question. What else should I be doing? Certainly with the people we engage with, I think we have to be frank about what it is that we're dealing with. I think often the education for practicing psychologists and maybe research psychologists as well is also do not acknowledge race as an issue. Diversify it. So the whole notion of multiculturalism, for example, essentially minimizes the matter of how much race is important in whatever it is that we do. And so I think it's really important for psychologists, even if you do not think that you are working with people of color, even if you think you were only working with white people, to essentially bring race into the room. Because Interestingly, now you're not really allowed to talk about abortions in your therapy session. But if a woman has a health issue, then she needs to understand how that health issue is not just a health issue, but it is also a power issue in the society. And that power issue is something that she should not internalize, but begin to fight in the same ways that one would fight about issues of racial dynamics. And so it's kind of beginning to bring together all of these issues in our work so that we're not treating them as separate things. I visualize, for instance, that maybe intake form now needs to ask people about all of the identities that they think matter to them, and the therapist needs to deal with all of those entities, those identities in the session with the person, because all of those things are mixed together to maintain a power structure.
Do we train people to do that?
Do we train people to do that?
Do you think we train people to do that?
No. But I think people have the skills that they could learn to do that.
Indeed.
It's just a matter of right now we train people to compartmentalize those things. And so there's some things they're supposed to talk about and some things they're not. And what we need to be able to do is to help people begin to think about wherever they are, whoever they are with, don't compartmentalize. Think about how these things are intersected and how you can bring that intersection into the conversation to deal with the issue of power more broadly.